final speaker tonight is someone that I actually just met. Tactaquin is Executive Director and co-founder of the National Network for Immigrant and Refugee Rights. She's the daughter of an immigrant farm worker from the Philippines. She was involved for many years in grassroots organizing and advocacy in the Filipino community on issues of discrimination and foreign policy. And she's a frequent speaker on topics ranging from global migration and human rights to race and gender perspectives and immigration reform. In 1994, Kathy helped to found Immigrant Rights International, a global alliance of migrant associations and other non-governmental organizations. She sits on the steering committee of MRI, representing NNIRR in the Global Coalition on Migration, and is on the board of Poverty, Race, and Research Action Council in Washington, D.C. She's a past recipient of the Bannerman Fellowship, an award recognizing outstanding activists of color, and was recently honored with the Community Activist Award from the Black Alliance for Just Immigration. And as I said before, Kathy and I had never met until tonight, but I'm so happy that she could come, and the reason that we decided to invite her is that I'm so inspired by her work, and DSA is a member organization of the National Network for Immigrant and Refugee Rights, and for me personally, it's immigration and immigrant rights is a personal political issue. And I think that NNIRR's perspective on migrant rights and how immigration intersects with so many other structures and realities in our economy is so important. So I am very, very honored that she was able to come tonight. I'm so happy to have met her, and I know that we're going to love what she has to say tonight. So please join me in welcoming her.
So glad that you invited me. Everyone's mentioning 1969, so for me it was a great year. It was the year I graduated from high school. I did my first civil disobedience like 3 months after that. My parents didn't know. Against the war in Vietnam. It's been downhill ever since. So I'm here speaking.
We're both short.
I'm so short. Okay, but I have to tell you a story. 3 weeks ago, I had the honor of being the messenger for Global Civil Society and actually presented at a plenary of the UN General Assembly in New York, where they took up, it was the UN High-Level Dialogue on International Migration and Development. So it's this big, imposing room. Most of the, there weren't heads of states there by then. This was a couple of weeks afterwards, or, foreign ministers and other staff. Most of them were on their iPads and telephones. But it's such an imposing room, and they have this huge, imposing podium with all the bells and whistles on it. And I'm so short, I actually could not see over the top. So I'm standing on my tiptoes, and there's a tape of it. And after a while, I realized I couldn't do that the whole time. So you can see me actually settling back down on my heels, but I could actually not see over the edge of this podium. So glad to have something that's a little lower. As Maria said, I'm speaking on behalf of, and from the experience of the National Network for Immigrant and Refugee Rights. We're a human rights organization. I do come out the left. Before I was director of the National Network, was involved in a variety of organizations and institutions and activities on the left and to the left of DSA, I have to say, from our view. In years past. But I think the question of immigration is actually a great window to look through in terms of the task that the left and I think all progressives have. And Steve, I really agree with, a lot of things that Steve laid out. Immigration today is I think when we started out doing this work, before the internet, before email, practically before fax, immigration was not a common issue. And I can remember here in Oakland, we used to go down to DeLauer's and look for, get the New York Times, get the LA Times, and scour the pages for news on immigration. And we would actually copy and mail articles to other activists around the country. And we had to do, calls or personal visits, movement building. Just connecting was a very different experience. And we'd send out a monthly packet. Maybe it would have like 4 articles in it. It's a very different world today. The media, social media, communications is very different. So a lot has transpired just in the time that I've been doing this work. But a lot of things, unfortunately, also have not been in terms of legislation and kind of what's out there and what's popularized as something that's progressive and good. Comprehensive immigration reform basically is a package deal of compromises that was cobbled together a lot by the leadership of the Democratic Party, based on focus groups on what the bottom line is that the public will support and endorse. And frankly, it has a lot of bad stuff in it. It's a comprehensive immigration reform is still based on the notion that national security interests have to come first. Immigration policy has to serve national interests. We need guest workers. We need cheap, viable, temporary workers in this country. We need greater border enforcement. Those are platforms of comprehensive immigration reform. There's a lot of people, a lot of rights, a lot of protections that are being thrown under the bus as part of that deal, which includes a very bad legalization program. So it's very misleading. Unfortunately, that's what's on the table now. And even as it is, it's stalled. And what we heard yesterday from President Obama was basically what we've been actually hearing for a number of months, which is laying out the blame game for the Republicans, laying the groundwork for the midterm elections, and eventually the general election, the next general election. And unfortunately, immigration, like so many other issues, kind of follows that electoral path. And frankly, in our view, the stars were not aligned for the passage of a good, fair immigration reform bill. All the pushing to get the House to take up immigration reform, where Boehner has said, we're not interested in doing that, we'll just take up piecemeal bills, is not the path to go. We really don't want the House to take up piecemeal immigration bills that are basically right now going to promote guest workers, greater border security, greater interior security, E-Verify, which is a program, a workplace verification program. So there's a lot of misleading information and strategies that are out there. The Senate has already passed a pretty bad version of immigration reform, which again is held up as something that's good. And is popularized in the media. And I think these are, this is still, I think some of the problems even within our movement is that kind of critical analysis about even legislation, which is, it's very complicated. We're talking about a 1,000+ page bill, is hard to understand. And there's very active campaigning and in fact critique of those in the progressive movement, organizations like ours, American Friends Service Committee, I think a number of other voices there that have critiqued that kind of legislation as being naysayers, as not having credibility, as not kind of playing ball with mainstream politics. I think, what we finally have in terms of legislation is certainly what has evolved is some support for a legalization program as opposed to massive deportation. So I guess that's some kind of a win. But it's a legalization program that will take a dozen years to go through with no guarantees for citizenship at the end of it, and without access to benefits or services, even access to the healthcare exchange along the way. The Senate bill that was passed a few months ago, in the final 3 days before the bill was passed, included this huge border surge amendment, which was a concession that the Democrats agreed to the Republicans, which was a $46 billion budget to increase border security over the next 10 years along the US-Mexico border. Kind of outrageous, to the extent that even the members of the Senate were calling it militarization, a term which they had, no one was going to use that on the floor of the Senate, so it was kind of shocking that this was so transparent that even they were calling it militarization of the border. But this is the kind of compromise that we're stuck with, and we think it's untenable. But it's a strategy that is being strongly pushed, and basically it's to win elections. What we're faced now, in just the immediate sense, we don't think the Republicans feel any hurry to pass immigration reform. They're not going to be hurt by lack of Latino votes in midterm elections. Where there's any seats, they're very secure with their Tea Party seats. The Dems probably have, more to lose, but frankly, they're not in the driver's seat on this in terms of a bill in the House. So there's not much to really push this forward. I think in the near future, when we're looking at the news over the next few months, the press to get something passed by the end of the year, I don't think it's likely that anything's going to go through the House. And in fact, we don't want the House to take up the bills that are under consideration. There's another window of opportunity, which would be the next 3 months of next year before things really get going, before the midterm election push. And then it's after the midterms. And then there's this very small window after the midterms because, frankly, in the next year, they're going to begin the campaign for the general elections. And no one really wants immigration reform to be on the table. So this is kind of the problem when you're looking at, legislation cannot go with movement. And when your strategy is so tied to the election, it's not an environment which is very useful for us in terms of immigration. And I think, Steve, what you raised is so important. We have a long way to go to do the kind of transformative work that's needed to affect some real changes that are even minimally possible through Congress, not just on immigration, but on any other issue. And what folks don't realize is that a lot of the legislation that we're dealing with is stuff that's already been so badly compromised. So in California, I'm glad the Domestic Workers Bill went through. The Trust Act, folks may know about the Trust Act that went through. Those were not, the bills that went through were a far cry from the bills that were originally introduced. They were badly compromised along the way. And this is with control of the Assembly and the Senate by the Democrats and a Democratic governor in California. We couldn't get that far. So, there's still so much more work that needs to be done on the ground. A big concern with the immigration, at the national level now, is that it is throwing some very fundamental questions out there. And in particular, I think we all have to be concerned about what is the major compromise, which is on increased border enforcement. And unfortunately, the border is that, it's the border, it's not mainstream America. It appears to be a much more, isolated issue. But this is, the increase in enforcement, the rationale that it's national security that's necessary in order to increase border enforcement. There's a lot of buy-in into that. And that begins to set the status quo about what's politically acceptable. In the last national immigration bill that was passed in 1986, the compromise for legalization, on the other side of that was employer sanctions, which was the provision that supposedly would penalize employers for continually and knowingly hiring undocumented workers. That effectively was the legal basis for the criminalization of undocumented workers and kind of the grandfather of a lot of the repressive bills and programs that we continue to see today. So it's not the fact that border enforcement is such is kind of the issue that is at the heart of the compromise is a very serious one. But I think, for those of us who oppose that, I think it's kind of identified as, a very extreme or ultra-left position. So it does get identified with, with left. In terms of what we kind of continually has been acceptable, and what Obama didn't talk about when he did the press conference yesterday, was the fact that over 400,000 people are deported every year. And while many people, even in our movement, chastise Obama for racking up these high numbers of deportations, on another level, he is carrying out policy that's been set since the 1990s. And it's based on basically an immigration policy that says we need to deport all that are deportable. That continues to be a cornerstone of immigration policy. A problem with kind of blaming, Obama too, is that it represents too some, I think, a lot of mischaracterization or perspectives even within the progressive movement that this guy was going to be a transformative figure. Obviously, he wasn't, and it's kind of out of that disappointment that even within the immigrant rights movement, comes a critique that he's even worse than Bush. Without understanding that it's been the politics of the right that have dominated this policy for decades and continue. And the Democratic Party has not challenged that, and just continues to move with that as kind of the practical political environment that it's been given. So you have Obama claiming bragging rights for having more boots on the ground, and he's very fond of using that term, having more boots on the ground at the border than any other previous administration. And they consider that the down payment for legalization. So what do we do? What do we need to do? And I think, in the immigrant rights movement, and certainly in the national network, we're always, I think, looking for where is the left, where is the progressive movement, whether the answer is socialism as a framework or not, I'm not saying. But I think it's clear to us that, our strategies on immigration, particularly on immigration, but it's the same on many issues, really have to go beyond the idea of immediate wins. A real danger within our movement, and I think it characterizes a lot of other movements as well, is that we have a professional cadre of organizations, nonprofits, 501c3s, that are really the backbone of our movement, and I think it's unfortunate. They are beholden to corporate-driven foundations that fund them, and those are the same foundations and donors behind the Democratic Party and the Republican Party. It's a real limitation to not just thinking out of the box, but it's a constriction on the kind of work that needs to be done to build a movement that in fact can be transformative, that can have our own boots on the ground, while at the same time have the capacity, the institutional sophistication and political know-how to move on a scope and scale that we need. So I believe that's, there's something certainly about politics and values, but I also have to, I think we need to look at what has become a substitute for activism and organizations over the last 30 years. And within this crowd, I think we should certainly all be familiar with that. We have activists, young activists who are coming into the movement who know nothing about any other form of organizing other than that which is driven by 501c3s, nonprofit organizations, who, for those of us who grew up and became active before there was foundation support, where you had to depend on stipends and good old grassroots organizing and fundraising for survival, that's a mystery to a lot of young activists. They're used to being a paid activist, they're used to being part of a nonprofit organization, and it's a real limitation. So there are some things that I think we need to break out of. The other thing with immigration, because it is so legislatively driven, the organizations that dominate this work are largely based in Washington. They're part of the whole Washington community. Their successes are not necessarily based in strengthening the grassroots base, but in scoring points with unlikely bedfellows, including conservatives, in order to get that immediate win. So they paint a picture of the political environment and believe they're being politically practical in order to get something through, and it's only going to get worse. We're going to have to find alignment with conservatives to get their support. That's been the story for immigration reform for the last 15 years. That's a strategy, and we call it the CIR strategy in a very negative way, the comprehensive immigration reform strategy. That is based on a preset sense of what that compromise is going to be. I would say over the last 5 years that strategy has been funded to the tune of $120 million by foundations. Our organization didn't see a dime of that. It's been heavily supported. That has funded the focus groups. So instead of relying on kind of, the organizing on the ground, getting a sense of where people are at, the relationships with different sectors, communities, politics, the sense of the media message, and the capacity to heavily fund that. A lot of that is based on kind of focus group type of work, so it's not based on organizing. A lot of money has gone to paying so-called professional organizers to put together electoral style campaigns that again has nothing to do with grassroots organizing and alignment, relationship building. It's very much designed to moving certain votes, and it mimics a lot of electoral politics and campaigns. So at least in the immigrant rights movement, it's while there's you look at the newspaper, you look at the media every day, you'll see a lot of immigration is in the news constantly. What's behind that is a very mixed bag, and unfortunately, a lot of it is still driven by Washington insider politics. And especially in the current period, I think, with the Obama administration, once Obama came into office, there's a lot of confusion of having access with having influence and power. So I won't say that all those folks who were aligned behind Obama yesterday at the press conference had that same confusion, but I'll bet 3/4 of the folks in that room did have that confusion. So you can imagine what it means to be pulled into closed-door meetings in the White House with Obama. And you are brought into kind of the strategy to win immigration reform. And you are told this is the direction that it's going to be. You cannot pressure the administration to stop deportations. The pressure has to be on the House to vote on immigration reform, even though we don't want them to vote on the House, the bills that are there. This can be very dizzying and influential for any kind of movement. And it's not just the immigrant rights movement that gets pulled in like that. So without that kind of sense of strategy, strategic vision, independence, these are very kind of heady days for a lot of folks within the movement. In terms of, I think where, as progressives and as left, we can be certainly much more influential. I know for the national network and a lot of groups that we work with, we've understood for a long time that we're never going to win immigration justice and rights for immigrants with a go-it-alone strategy that's just based on immigration. So obviously immigration is not a domestic issue, it's a global issue. And the forces that continue to drive global migration, regardless of immigration reform passing in any shape or form here in the US, is not going to change those dynamics. So since I started working on immigration, or since the network was formed, I would say, there's been such a dramatic increase in global migration. We're talking about 260 million people in migration around the world today. Some, that includes refugees, that includes people who are internally displaced, a lot of people who cross international borders without documents. It's a population that has changed demographically, and we see that here. The old pattern of migration was the male migrant worker. That pattern has completely changed with the necessity for women to migrate as well. And when women migrate, children are part of the migration stream. Our migration policies domestically are so out of sync with the scope and scale of migration, but also the demography of migration. And it's not, it's not like we don't have a gender neutral policy. There's a lot of built-in biases to what already exists. And we replicate that globally. War, militarism, unemployment, extreme conditions of poverty, all the effects of neoliberalism, all the negative impacts of globalization continue to drive migration. So immigration reform itself is not going to fix that. And that's why we've been also actively involved at the global level, working with other similar migrant networks, but also evolving relationships with other groups with whom we feel we have a shared analysis and a common cause. That's included the environmental movement. We have a strong and growing relationship with Via Campesina, the global movement of farmers and peasants. We work with groups in other countries, not just doing work on migration, but on economic justice in those countries. One of our major allies internationally is the indigenous movement, certainly here, but globally. And they recognize we're often the same people, and we have a shared sense of population and cause. So those are the kinds of and they are movement building, and I think we actually do need to, I don't think movements just happen, so sometimes there is a spark, but I believe we have to be proactive in actually constructing and guiding and helping to shape those movements, and also build institutions that can be a vehicle and a space for those who come into movements to mature and grow and to become actual active political forces. And I think this is, you know, kind of a dilemma with things like Occupy and even other movements within immigrant rights, that where there is a spark. Often what we're lacking are institutions that can move all the folks who are captured, you know, within that movement into something that's going to be, that's going to grow and mature and be more politically productive. I wanted to, you know, I think I mentioned the problem that the Democratic Party in particular. I just want to continue to raise that because it's something that certainly has come up over the last couple of weeks more and more within our movement. And again, not that the Democratic Party is worse than the Republican Party, but the particular situation where we're in now, where there are some windows of opportunity, but where we're also held back by a reliance of key sectors and movements on the Democratic Party. A couple of months ago, I was at the AFL-CIO convention, and it was actually good to hear rumblings kind of from the speakers, but also on the floor, about the over-reliance of the AFL-CIO on the Democratic Party. And it's certainly something that we've seen even within the immigrant rights movement, where the AFL-CIO was put in a position by the White House to negotiate with business over certain pieces of immigration reform, specifically guest worker policy. And you know, they kind of started out with one position, and business had another position. They kind of came to a meeting. And there was actually some decent stuff that came out of that negotiation. But it was also very problematic that they had to give their blessing to a policy that actually is not healthy and is a problem. And it has a lot to do with their relationship with the Democratic Party and specifically with the administration. That just continues to play out, and so the catering to the Democratic Party, I'm not sure exactly what needs to be done, but I think that the need for greater independence is something as a movement that is very important, and in particular I think broader institutions, both at a local level, at a state level, and at a national level, because I think those are all points of intervention that we need to take seriously, particularly as progressives and the left. I think we need to construct relationships, provide spaces for strategic thinking, and shared values that can certainly represent the best interests of working people, but also think about how we can build new and flexible institutions that are capable, one, of incorporating greater diversity, different languages, different histories and cultures that are multi-generational. I know we struggle with that constantly, even in the kind of institution that we are. I think it's even more of a challenge for organizations that are playing other kinds of political roles. And even, you know, and I'll give an example, way back when we had the Rainbow Coalition was being built. And some folks will remember the Rainbow Coalition. At the founding conference of the Rainbow Coalition, we noticed that within the charter for that institution, membership was going to be based on citizenship, and there was a large, you know, contingency of immigrants who were part of that founding convention. and we found this out at the last minute, brought it to their attention, had some very difficult discussions. That was eventually taken out of the charter, but it was because at that point, even the Rainbow Coalition was looking at itself as a possible electoral party. So, you know, even in building these kinds of institutions, again, kind of the flexibility, I think the ability to separate ourselves from strictly, you know, from electoral campaigning, electoral forms of organization are going to be very important. And I'm mindful that even in our work, while it's very hard to manage, you know, a national organization, you know, a national network, especially based among immigrant communities, and we would love to have greater foundation support. I think we've learned that it's just very important that we establish an independence from the domination of corporate-driven foundations, and certainly of corporate interests. And I was just going to say, you know, part of building, you know, continuing to build the intersection, I wanted to get back to something that Steve had mentioned about legalization, and, you know, wouldn't it be great if we also took up a work around the prisons. And actually that is some of the exciting work that is being taken up, and where we're also struggling to look at new forms of organizing. So we are part of the National Private Prison Divestment Campaign, which has targeted prison construction companies like GEO and the Corrections Corporation of America, which are actually global corporations. They're highly profitable. Lots of hedge funds, others, pension funds have been invested in them. They lobby hard for a greater funding of private prison development as well as detention centers. We work together in this coalition with groups that are also challenging policies of mass incarceration and also drug policy. And it's a great intersection because in challenging the militarization of the border, there's no way that we're going to begin to demilitarize the border, especially the US-Mexico border, without attention to and without challenging the so-called war on drugs. So part of the whole rationale for continuing to fund and increase enforcement at the border is that it's part of the war against drugs. So on a very practical level, those are relationships that are being built out of political necessity, yet how they're being housed in terms of you know, our coalitions need a lot greater strength, and we need to build capacity to function on scope and at a certain level of scope and scale. And we hear a lot of discussion, I think, about that in the movement as a whole. So in terms of greater support, certainly from the left and progressive movement, and thinking about how we can do that, and I don't know where some of this conversation might be in the DSA convention, but I hope we're all kind of looking at how we examine our own institutions and create the kind of flexible ways that we can partner, create new partnerships, build relationships that are based on equality, and build institutions that are going to be able to actually have political impact, you know, but at the same time bringing the kinds of unified values and vision to them. So I'm going to stop there. Thanks again.